Good evening and welcome to London Ballet Circle and this evening's In Conversation. Our guest tonight is Jaimie Tapper. A transplanted Canadian, Jaimie was a principal with the National Ballet of Canada and the Royal Ballet. And now she's an organizational psychologist working for a number of dance schools, companies, and dance organizations. So how did Jaimie get from Western Canada to where she is now, speaking to us at LBC? Well, we're going to find out. And asking the questions, I'm delighted to welcome back Maggie Foyer, who is a great dance writer and critic and good friend to LBC. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for taking the time for us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Susan. And Jaimie, welcome. I'm delighted to be introducing you and your important work to the London Ballet Circle. With current concerns about young people and mental health, coupled with the demands and stresses of a ballet career, I'm sure there's a huge amount here to interest people. So to start, your transition, you made a very successful transition, retraining as an organisational psychologist. I'd like you to explain what an organisational psychologist does and about the stages of your move, because you went into other fields before joining back into the ballet world.
Okay, so I'll try and keep it a bit brief, but it's a sort of windy story. As Susan said, I'm Canadian. I hail from Canada and trained at Canada's National Ballet School. So I trained there between the ages of 11 and 17, and then joined Canada's national company, National Ballet of Canada, in 1994. And actually, Reed Anderson was my first director, so he gave me my first job. And then decided, in order to, I suppose, give myself a sort of different sort of challenge, that it would be useful to sort of leave the place that I knew and kind of strike out, and perhaps be in a company where there were lots and lots of people to learn from. So came over to join the Royal Ballet Company in 1999, and Sir Anthony Dowell was the director then. I very fortunately had worked with him the year before. He was setting Month in the Country in Canada, so I got to work with him quite closely on that. And so then knocked on his door and said, "Do you have a job for me?" And I was very lucky that he said he did. So joined the company as a soloist and had a happy number of years between 1999 and 2007, sort of progressing through the ranks and getting to dance lots of great roles and work with really interesting people. I always suspected that I'd want to do something else after being a dancer, and that I wanted to go back to school, that I was likely to have to go back to school for whatever I was doing next. So took the somewhat unusual decision to retire a little bit earlier than many people do, but partly because I suspected it would take me a while to retrain. So I wanted to give myself some time to do that. So I actually started my retraining whilst I was still dancing. I did my first degree whilst I was principal dancer at the Royal Ballet. So I did a research-based degree. And then after retiring, went on to do a couple more degrees, one a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, and then a Master's of Science in Organisational Psychology. And organisational psychology, it does need some explanation. It doesn't mean that I'm any better than anyone else at organising anything, certainly. But essentially what it means is that I'm a psychologist that focuses my work in organizations. So that might be working with individuals with organizations, but it might also be looking at systemic issues in organizations and what the world of psychology and sort of evidence-based practice can bring to the world of work to make things better, to make us more effective, to make us more healthy, to suit the needs of the business, but also the needs of the individuals who are working in the organization. So it's an interesting area of psychology in that it gives practitioners the ability to work in lots of different ways, either working one-to-one with people or working much more sort of around systems and policies and kind of how we do things in organizations. So like I say, more at the systemic level. Having graduated and qualified, I worked for a health organization in London for over a decade. And that was a great opportunity because it was a relatively small health organization. So it meant I could really get my teeth into sort of all of the organizational issues that impact on an organization and the employees who are working with very vulnerable people around their health, and to be effective in working with vulnerable people, but also to stay healthy themselves, because as we know, people who work in health, it's a lot of pressure and stress on them and quite emotionally draining. So as organizations, we have a responsibility to make sure that they're kind of getting what they need to be able to continue to do their jobs well. And alongside doing that work in the organization, I had a sort of private practice working with dancers and dance organizations. So that sort of started slowly and then built and built. And then a few years ago, it occurred to me that I probably, could be doing all of my work back within dance as an industry and would find that really satisfying to be able to do that. So sort of started seriously speaking to Kevin O'Hare about developing a role within the company that would sort of use the skills and the experience that I had in order to meet some of the needs that he saw within the company on the organizational level and on the health within some of the sort of psychological health areas as well.
Jaimie, you talk about vulnerability. Now, as a dancer, you're using your body. You're very physically in there with all the issues that come up with that, and all the, as well as being on the physical side and getting the technical training, there's also the emotional side of being an actor, of creating roles. So is there something very much more deep-rooted in looking after dancers than, say, a vulnerable health patient?
I'm going to give a sort of simplistic answer first, which is that kind of human beings are the same all over, and in different areas, sort of people struggle with some of the same things. In many ways, I would say working with dancers is relatively straightforward in that they tend to be quite a healthy population psychologically. And part of the reason for that is that, by the time they get to work with me in a company like the Royal Ballet Company, they're unlikely to have kind of made it to that sort of level in that stage if they were sort of hugely vulnerable psychologically. They will have had to have developed lots of strategies to support themselves over the years to kind of deal with the challenges of the career and the training. So they actually tend to be quite robust people, but the work itself is challenging and the life is challenging to some extent. And so it sort of brings, I suppose, some specific risks, but it also brings some, it has some protective factors as well. So, for example, you mentioned that they're they work with their bodies and are quite physically fit. And what we know with mental health is that there is a connection with sort of physical health too. So people who take care of their bodies and are physically fit doesn't mean that they're completely protected from any sort of issues around their mental health, but they tend to have a better shot at kind of having good mental health.
Yes, because the actual, I think one of the problems with the youngsters today is we're so careful of the touch because it can be misread in so many ways. Yet watching, certainly in ballet schools at a fairly high level, young men and women coming together in pas de deux classes, I find that fascinating. The way the young men suddenly become so much more responsible and respectful because they have this precious dancer that they mustn't drop on her head. Is there something there that protects dancers too, that respect for one another?
Yeah, well, I think that connection to the body is really important, and whether that's, dancing on your own and sort of feeling connected to your own body and is helpful. And, dance is wonderful as an activity because unlike many things in the modern world, it's unmediated by technology. It's a kind of real old school activity, and in that you don't need any technology to do it. But also it does, dance also brings people together. And that's the reason why dance has been around, in human history for a very long time, is it's a kind of, a form of communication and celebration and ritual And I think, you know, dancers today also gain from that kind of foundational value to dance, in that it's a social activity, isn't it? And it's sort of, and it allows us, particularly as we're going through those, you know, really tender teenage years, and we're sort of figuring ourselves out, to have a group of people that we do that with, and to be embodied as we're doing it too. So we're not just having to work out, you know, socially how we get on with people, but also, you know, how we work together physically as well. So it can be a great kind of leveler and teacher around how to be a good human being.
Very well put, yes. Jaimie, one of the big issues in dance is the body shape, and there's a huge amount in the press, often very negative, about demands on the body. You're dealing with people at the top level. They've probably worked out how to deal with their diet. But do you deal with the school at all, and where there are more problems, and how do dancers cope with this? How can you help them?
So yes, I mean, I do, most of my work is with the Royal Ballet Company, but I also sort of retain 1 day a week that I work as a consultant in a few other places. So the Royal Ballet School, I do some work for Canada's National Ballet School and a few other schools. What I would say is, I think the industry has been quite conscientious in recognizing that we have some specific challenges and issues within the industry, and one of them is eating disorders and disordered eating. And so I think there's been a lot of work to try to both acknowledge, but also to do something, you know, to genuinely try to tackle that. We don't have really sort of depth of good data that we can fall back on, but just to put it in context, I mean, what I would say, which might be interesting for the audience, is that the sort of, from the best data we have, the rates of eating disorders and disordered eating within professional and vocational dance are largely in line with what you would see in aesthetic sports like gymnastics, or in weight-based sports, so kind of combat sports, where it's important that you have maximum strength at the as lowest weight possible, because there's a sort of competitive advantage to that. And also to sports where a kind of lightness is quite crucial for competitiveness. So things like long distance running. So we have sort of similar rates of eating disorders and disordered eating as you would find in those sorts of sports. So I think, you know, there's something here which is quite fundamental to dance as an art form that is a challenge for us. One is the aesthetic, which is that, you know, line sometimes can look more effective on a slim body, you know, and sort of be easier to sort of see and to appreciate. But also that we're looking for a kind of balance between lightness and strength. And that's both for sort of jumping, you know, so for being able to get elevation, really good elevation, but also obviously for partnering as well. So I think it's always going to be a bit of a challenge. I think we've seen some really big improvements, both in the professional industry and within vocational training. And certainly schools and companies are putting more and more resource and focus on this. But we certainly haven't kind of worked it out completely. Within the Royal Ballet Company, and they have a similar system within the Royal Ballet School, we take it really seriously. And we have a sort of multidisciplinary team that's looking at trying to catch as early as possible when there are concerns around a dancer's weight. Some of the audience might have heard of relative energy deficiency, but this is a syndrome which can be quite common in certain sports and within dance as well. And this is essentially when the athlete or the dancer is not taking in enough sort of calories for the amount of energy output, and that can have all sorts of detrimental effects. But sometimes that's not a purposeful choice by the dancer or the athlete. It can also stem from the sort of culture and working practices. So for example, dancers work very long hours. And so companies and individual dancers have to work quite hard to make sure that they're sort of fueling properly during the day. So, and actually it's surprising how many calories a dancer needs to sustain the amount of output. So you might watch a dancer during the day and they seem to be eating a lot of food, but in fact they might be under fueling because their sort of calorie output is their energy output is so high.
Yeah. Fortunately, the Opera House has a wonderful canteen.
Yes, yeah, it does have a very good canteen. And, you know, I think there are a number of kind of initiatives from Ballet Healthcare around sort of making available sort of, you know, really good snacks that can be eaten between rehearsals, things like that as well. So just to make sure that dancers are continuing to fuel themselves well.
There's a question coming from Fiona. I'll read it all out. You mentioned dancers being healthy physically and therefore perhaps less affected by mental health issues. I wonder if you have encountered problems in the opposite direction. That is, where there is a high mental stress, whether from internal or external factors on an individual. Can this lead to physical problems? And how would you work with such an individual?
Absolutely. I mean, and we tend to see this sort of direction of travel, I suppose, less within the world of dance and sort of with athletes, you know, for people where it's, you know, they have to work quite hard maybe to sort of exercise and take care of themselves. But absolutely, if your mental health is suffering, in fact, you know, often what you start to see is you know, that there's an impact on people's physical health. And that might be in sort of changes of behavior around taking care of themselves, but also that they're more susceptible to you know, injury, to illness, that sort of thing as well.
Yes. Sorry, what? I was going to say, you talked about your organisational psychologist. Your work has been mainly with the Royal Ballet Company, a very large, well-established classical company, but you said your private work often involved smaller companies and so on. I travel a lot and I see the difference between how some companies work well, sometimes a director will move on and there's a sudden huge chasm where nothing seems to work. How can you as an individual understand, obviously we're not going to talk about the Royal Ballet, but looking at an enormous, I mean, running an opera house is like running a small village. How, when things do start going through a bumpy patch, what can be done to help?
Well, I suppose I have a kind of way of looking at the sort of organizational practices and sort of trying to get information and sort of diagnose maybe where is the priority area. And this is something I've made up. It comes from the evidence base, you know, how you sort of try to kind of unpick where things are going wrong. And so, you know, when I came into the Royal Ballet Company, I'd spent quite a bit of time talking to people, as you would expect, psychologists, but sort of talking to people at all levels in the organization, talking to the whole artistic team, and sort of getting a sense of what individual jobs were like, but also sort of where the challenges were in individual jobs. And that started to give me a sense of, you know, what might be some of the priority areas for us to work on as an organization that might have a positive impact on the whole organization. So this might be things like the level of demands on employees, the amount of control they have within their work to sort of make decisions or make adjustments. How effective is the communication amongst people in the organization? How clear are they on their roles and other people's roles? How much role clarity is there? How much support do they receive, and what are the relationships like within the organization? And when you talk to enough sort of employees, you start to sort of, I guess, build a bit of a picture of sort of what are the things that seem to be working quite well, and maybe what are the areas that might not be working as well as we would like. And that sort of gives a little bit of a direction of travel, I suppose, of where to start. Because you're right, it can seem like quite an overwhelming, organizations have a lot going on.
Yeah.
Where do you start? So I suppose where I start is talking to lots of people and trying to get a sense of if you know, a lot of people are talking about the same thing, you know, the sort of the same sorts of challenges, and that gives us a starting point.
Yes. You've talked about the problems that are very similar in the gymnastic sports, etc., and in an organizational, because dance is an art form, and because there is an artistic urge to get this one show on and every person in it, whether you're, you know, from the wardrobe to the lighting to the dancers to the orchestra, we all pull together for that. Do you think the fact that art is the supreme goal, that sounds a bit pretentious, but that the organizations have that primary goal? It's not just like, I want my team to win this cup. It's about creating something. Do you feel that's a great help with the mental stability?
Yes, I mean, I think it's one of the things that you can see generally from a fairly young age with dancers, with people who gravitate towards dance, in sort of, I suppose, a serious way, you know, who kind of seem quite determined to do this activity and do it at a fairly high level, is that they seem to gain some pleasure from that communal effort towards something, you know, and the sense of community that brings, but also that kind of individual responsibility to contribute to this thing, which is more than them. And so I think that's hugely important. It also, I suppose, can have a bit of a dark side in that, you know, in a ballet company, it can create a little bit of a culture of sort of everything's always an emergency because the curtain goes up every night, you know, so it's sort of, you know, it can feel a little bit like crisis mode, and generally people who go into this profession are pretty good in a crisis, and sometimes we can get a little bit overly used to it, and so one of the things which I think is interesting, you know, because I don't have responsibility for putting the show on, and so I don't have that particular kind of weight on my shoulders, is to sort of look at, you know, whether there are times when we could slow things down, you know, that might be decision making, because in fact, you know, there's this sort of always on feeling within a performing company, you know, of must get the show on, and that's absolutely true. We do have to get the show on. We have to have enough bodies on stage, and hopefully it's really good quality what we're putting on the stage. But then you're also going to have to do it the next night and the next night and the next night. So how do we do that and be sustainable, so that it doesn't become kind of sacrificial of individuals within that system? Yeah.
And a question's come up that relates exactly to that, from Jess Glennie. I'm wondering how you negotiate situations in which the best welfare of an individual dancer you're working with might not align with the needs of the company.
Yeah, such a good question. And I think, you know, it's the sort of privilege of my position in some ways that that I can sort of make observations and like, you know, work with let's say individual dancers, but also with the artistic director to try and navigate that, because you know, the truth is the artistic director in the end does have to put a performance on the stage and has to think about the needs of the whole organization. So as much as possible, we are sort of trying to navigate and balance that. And, you know, I think there have been huge strides, hopefully in many ballet companies, but certainly in the Royal Ballet, to promote the needs of the individual, but it all needs to fit within that package of the organization. And that sometimes means that, you know, you do have to disappoint people, or, you know, kind of balance that out. I mean, when it comes to the health of an individual, there is some tolerance within the system. In other words, there's sort of enough dancers, just enough, that there are no ballets that require every single dancer of the Royal Ballet to be on stage at once. So there's a certain amount of flexibility, and that's always kind of what made ballet companies work, is you know, you have this very clever group of dancers who can learn lots of different roles, and part of their key skills is their ability to sort of jump into different things and kind of, you know, fairly last minute. So, you know, there's some very careful negotiation between ballet healthcare and artistic management. They have really great processes in place in order to do that, so that everybody's on the same page and has an opportunity to feed into the final decision. And it is really this kind of decision of what is best for the individual. That is the first question. And then how are we going to fill that gap if the best thing for them is not to be on stage in a way that's not going to put any of their colleagues at risk either. So it is that constant kind of balance.
Yes, tricky balance there. Jaimie, was there a specific incident or a moment in your training or your career when it sort of came to you that dancers do need maybe a little more help with mental health, and in your time it probably wasn't supplied in a company?
It would be quite a neat story if there was a specific incident. So I kind of hate to disappoint in a way, but I think, I probably didn't have the insight as I was going through it to kind of recognize that. And often that's the way, isn't it? It's sort of after the fact that you kind of look back and you sort of think, oh, that was a hard time, or that was a difficult decision, and it might have been useful for me to have someone independent to speak about that with. What I would say is that, the dance world has been probably a little bit slow in providing this sort of support to dancers working at the very high levels. Again, if you compare it to sort of elite sport or other industries that people are working at a very sort of high level, a competitive level. And the other thing which makes it a little bit more complicated perhaps is that dancers as an occupational group are quite young. They sort of, I started my career, I signed my first contract when I was 17. So they're kind of still going through, I suppose, their maturation and their development, whilst they actually have a lot of professional responsibility. So there's that aspect, and there's also the aspect that many dancers do their vocational training far from home and family as well. So kind of, as much as possible, the vocational training, I think, have gotten better at recognizing that they need to really protect that relationship between parents and children as they're going through that process. But dancers who go through that system in some ways have to grow up quite young. They sort of have a level of responsibility and independence quite young compared to most other teenagers.
Yes, you talked about the having to leave home to go to boarding schools, because obviously not all the parents in the one area will all have the right sort of children to become top ballet dancers. But also this issue that sometimes arises in a graduating class, youngsters have already started building relationships with others, and then one person will get a job in Canada and the other one in Australia. And so there's that fracture happens in many ways. What sort of, are you aware of that in the Royal Ballet? Are there people trying to maintain long distance relationships, and does that cause problems with their careers and their health?
What I would say is that it's much easier with modern technology than it used to be. So a kind of moving across the world, doesn't have to bring the sort of fracture perhaps that it did in the past. Because we have really good and quite inexpensive ways of staying connected to people. I think it is a challenge, but again, I suppose thinking about some of the skills that this sort of vocational training in the career teaches you is that it teaches you skills about how to kind of develop good working relationships with people quite rapidly, and sort of develop trust and intimacy, sort of appropriate intimacy in order to work well with people. And those are skills that you can take with you wherever you go, and it's also why dancers tend to be quite successful in their careers after their performing careers as well, is that they sort of have all of these skills that have been forged through their training and their professional lives, which of course they bring with them to the next things. And some of those around their ability to kind of fit in, to work as a team, to stand out when they need to and stand on their own, that kind of flexibility to be able to do both of those things.
Yeah. Yes, and I'd like to use that to come to making this transition, which all dancers have to do much earlier than other people would on retirement, because your dancer retirement is a step to another career. And you talked about the importance of cultivating interests outside of dance, which are quite difficult in a very demanding career. How can that be brought in at a school age, or because you obviously seem to have a lot of interests outside of dance, even, you know, while you were continuing to be a principal dancer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna say some things, and some of them might sound like they conflict with each other a little bit, but sort of stick with me here. You know, like many sort of elite activities, becoming a professional dancer does require a certain amount of single-mindedness, you know, and a certain number of hours that are really put towards this one kind of activity. I think we have sort of evolved in the industry and, you know, in the training, that we've recognized that actually we probably don't need to specialize quite as young as maybe we thought, and that there is some value in supporting and encouraging dancers to continue to invest in their lives outside of dancing as well, for lots of reasons, you know. One, you know, which feeds directly into their value as artists, or their abilities as artists, is particularly because it is quite a young occupational group, is, you know, what are they going to be able to bring artistically to roles if they have very few life experiences? And so, you know, when I work with students in schools, one of the things I'm often looking at is, you know, how much has this young person, as well as doing, you know, their training as dancers, kind of continued to hit the sort of developmental milestones that you would expect, and go through some of the rituals that you would expect of growing up, you know. So that might be things like learning to ride a bike, learning to swim, getting a part-time job in the summer, learning to drive, all those sorts of things. And those are sort of like, you know, some of the things that we do essentially to become adults. And for a long time, you know, dancers were sort of discouraged in a way, you know, from doing outside activities. And, you know, who needs to drive because you're going to be, you know, I don't know what the fantasy was, you're going to be chauffeured around when you're a ballerina or something like that. But actually those things are really important to having an independent life, you know, and sort of feeling like you're not marooned in this world of dance. But you know, there are different phases of the career, and there's certainly phases of the career where it's so intense that you really don't have a lot of time or energy to do much else. And you know, I did start my retraining whilst I was still a dancer, but, you know, in some ways, because I was a principal dancer by that point, that actually gave me a little bit more freedom and time, because I wasn't on stage every single night. So I had, you know, I had evenings, I had performances off. So although I was still working very hard, I wasn't kind of tied to work in the same way that I was when I was a soloist dancer and I was on in every single show. And I also had a little bit more kind of, I suppose, mental space to sort of look at other things. But I think, you know, it's a huge amount of pressure on dancers whilst they're trying to do one really, really challenging career, to say, oh, you need to also be working on the next one. You know, so I sort of tend to, when I'm working with dancers, look a little bit more on what's realistic, and maybe kind of, you know, continuing to keep some pleasurable sort of hobbies and interests alive, and invest in those things when they have time to do that. And then also be kind of looking at sort of career and age stages, and sort of, you know, start to have some conversations and do a little bit more long-term planning. But in reality, you know, many dancers won't be able to do their retraining for the next career whilst they're still dancing.
Yes, a question came in actually on dealing with motherhood, which is obviously trying to keep a life going while you're dancing. And certainly in my era, it was much more difficult. Many, you know, you either had to give up your career, or if you had a very wealthy husband who could look after you, that was fine. But now it does seem that companies are much more flexible about maternity leave and looking after babies. I know the Nordic countries have always been a little better than England, but I think England has caught up now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's still something that we're grappling with, and I suspect we always will be, because, you know, like in kind of any high achieving industry, but it's more compressed within dance, you have certain years which are your really fruitful years professionally. And, you know, that what makes it so challenging, obviously, for women is that those years intersect with your fertile years as well. So what you tend to see in many ballet companies is that dancers kind of leave having children as long as possible, because they're worried about how the disruptions will impact on their kind of promotions and kind of, you know, progression through the company. You do see in some places like Scandinavia, actually Russia as well, that there's more culturally, they tend to have children earlier. And they're sort of, but I mean, you know, if you sort of think the average dancer's career, you know, you're kind of lucky if it's 20 years. It could be shorter. For a few, it's a little bit longer, but it's around, you know, maximum the 20-year mark. To have a child and return to stage kind of takes almost 2 years out of that 20 year. And if you have 20 years, and if you have more than one child, then you just, you know, you add up the maths. But I think culturally, you know, there's certainly been a shift in that there's an expectation that you shouldn't have to choose. You know, you shouldn't have to choose either being a successful dancer or being a parent. But there's no question that it's a challenging career to have whilst being a parent, because of the unsociable hours, working on weekends, that sort of thing. But I mean, I had my first child whilst I was still dancing and returned to stage after having him. And, you know, I think people often sort of think about the physical aspect of it, you know, because pregnancy is such a physical transformation. But in, you know, from my perspective, the more challenging thing was the kind of the focus, you know, and sort of wanting to be in two places at once, essentially. Yeah.
And that actually feeds into having outside interests, because it's forced on you. And many dancers, I mean, also I see this sometimes in the level of artistry, the different level that women will come to after they've had children. They'll be a slightly different, or often a very different person. And that is such a plus for many careers. So it has its pluses and minuses, but it does need a supportive company.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, I think, you know, we're working very hard to make that work as well as possible for people. So, but you know, I think we also, you know, you know, I think it's also unfair to sort of pretend that it's going to be easy, because it's not. And any, you know, woman working at a high level in a career knows that that's true. There are going to have to be some compromises, probably on both sides, which are going to be challenging. But you know, the more modeling and more women that we see doing this within the ballet world, of course, the easier it makes it. You know, you stand out less. But we always are going to have this challenge of this compressed years of the career.
Yes. I just wanted to also, and I'll bring this next question in here. I was going to look at social media. I mean, I don't do a lot of Instagram or Facebook, but you look at these clips of umpteen pirouettes and, you know, 6 o'clock extensions, and some are doctored, obviously, but it's, and also when you see the youngsters coming out of schools, it must be quite a problem for dancers, sort of middle career, maybe not ones who've hit the highest, to suddenly seeing this incredible competition that comes in. Because Erica has sent in this question saying it must be very difficult for dancers to overcome disappointments, like over injuries and overseeing contemporaries getting promoted ahead of them and not getting the opportunities that they'd hoped for. So does social media play into that? Do you find, is it something that dancers are dealing better with now? This sort of jealousy, the sort of that terrible Black Swan film of dancers sort of tearing each other to shreds.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
it's
I'm
feeling
I'm gonna
better.
take those things separately because I think they're both quite big topics. And I mean, the sort of the jealousy question, I suppose. And I mean, it's interesting, you know, people sort of when they find out where I work or what I did before I do now, often raise the sort of the black swan kind of point. And it's interesting because I've never recognized that.
No.
In my experience as a dancer or working with dancers, that kind of that level of aggressive, I mean, obviously that was a horror film, so it was fantasy, but I've actually haven't felt that kind of level of sort of aggressive competitiveness within the industry. I mean, I think both as a dancer myself and also when I work with dancers, the bigger challenge tends to be criticality of the self, of kind of, dancers have, and this is in some ways necessary, a great ability to be self-critical. And that's part of the secret to their success, because that's one of the strategies they use to learn. But of course, if it gets overly self-critical, then it can be detrimental and it can impact their motivation and their enjoyment and all sorts of things. So, I think that kind of, I suppose that fantasy of that sort of competitive, that nasty competitiveness hasn't been my experience in real life within the industry, which isn't to say that there isn't a lot of disappointment, because if you take a company like the Royal Ballet, it has about 100 dancers, and currently we have about 20 principal dancers. So all you have to do is you have to look at the shape of the company to recognize that many dancers won't become principal dancers. But what I also know is that you can have a very satisfying career at every level of a ballet company. So part of this is about ensuring that we value every part of the company and every role that you play in that company, because otherwise we're setting a lot of people up for disappointment and failure. If the only route to satisfaction and success is becoming a principal dancer, most people won't do that. Yeah. So that's, I suppose, my answer to the first one. And the second one, social media, I suppose, is in some ways a bit of a bigger issue. I was lucky enough to kind of come through both my schooling and my career before the real rise of social media. And it's been quite an experiment on all of humanity, social media. And the receipts are in, and it's not great for us, it turns out. It kind of amplifies some of the human challenges, and things like comparison and presenting sort of dishonest reality and all those sorts of things. And what we know is that it's particularly damaging for girls, social media. We have good evidence about that.
Sorry, Jaimie, is that more about body form and looks and that side of it with girls?
I mean, I think it's in part that, but it's also just about the different ways that boys and girls tend to socialize, and that boys, even when they're using kind of online platforms, tend to be more activity-based in the ways that they come together online, whereas girls tend to use more communication kind of methods, like in social media. So there's quite a key difference in terms of the sort of how they use it and also the impact. But certainly the fact that a lot of the content that they're seeing is pretty misogynistic isn't helpful as well. I mean, my sense is that we're coming through this experiment, and that a lot of the young people that I'm working now with in the school systems are kind of getting a handle on this stuff. It's perhaps kind of my generation and a little bit younger who are kind of struggling with it more, but I'm seeing a move in young people sort of away from living their lives online. I think they've seen for themselves that it doesn't make them particularly happy. Within the dance world, again, this is one of the other benefits of dance as an activity, is that it's unmediated by technology. So at the very least, what being a dancer, whether that's like as a recreational dancer or a professional dancer, means that for a certain number of hours of the day, you're going to be doing a physical activity, and you're not going to be on your phone, which is great. Yeah.
That's one of the best things about dance, I think.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, sorry, your dancers career development workshops.
Mm-hmm.
You said these are open, the adverts online say they're open to all genres, but you work predominantly in ballet environments. So my question is, do ballet dancers need more help, maybe than contemporary dancers, maybe because of the aesthetics of the form or the level of technique, or are contemporary dancers just more balanced human beings? Or can't they afford your services? Where do we sit?
So a couple of things. So yes, I do a certain amount of work through dancers' career development, and DCD has what's kind of called the companies program, which is essentially the ballet companies dedicate some of their funding to DCD, and then DCD provides services. So the workshops that I do with ballet companies are funded through that system. But what's really wonderful is that DCD has also been working really hard to make sure that their services are accessible to dancers who are doing other styles and to freelance dancers. So for a number of years, I've also actually delivered workshops to freelance dancers, which has been really interesting in terms of rounding out, I suppose, my experience of the dance world and the kind of differences and similarities and challenges. I don't think I would say that one group like contemporary or classical ballet dancers need more or less support. I think there's some differences in their kind of training and entry into the profession. So contemporary dancers often will have gone to university. So they kind of just have, in a way, a little bit more developmental time before they're kind of launched into professional life. And the sort of nature of the work, if you're in a contemporary dance company or if you're a freelance dancer, is in some ways less secure. So that brings its own challenges because you're sort of often more financially vulnerable. But it kind of forces you to develop skills because of that lack of security, which puts you in good stead for the future. But certainly contemporary dancers, and particularly freelance dancers, there's a real gap in the sort of support that they receive. So yeah, there's similarities and differences. I think, they're equally kind of needing and deserving of support. But I think that kind of the vocational training difference is one of the key differences I see.
Yeah. Because yes, as the ballet dancers having to go much younger. So if you get a child that is already doing most of their education through a boarding school, gets into a major company, and then stays with that company, by the time you get to leaving it, it's like a major divorce. That's been your family and your life. And it's quite a terrifying prospect. Whereas as you said, the contemporary dancers come are much more circuitous, and they often do project work and have to cope with unemployment and what the pluses and minuses that brings. Exactly.
Yeah. So it sort of brings some insecurity and vulnerabilities, but also it kind of, in a way, forces them to be a little bit more agile and to develop some different skills. The thing I would say about ballet dancers is, we still have this system. It has the age of entry has increased in many companies. So now you would not get into the Royal Ballet Company unless you were 19. Whereas certainly my generation of dancers, I signed my first contract at 17. I think Marinella Nunez was 16 when she auditioned for the company. We still were of that generation where we were kind of entering a little bit earlier. So there's been some movement there in terms of that kind of age of entry. And the other thing too is that dancers are more likely to move around, classical ballet dancers, than they were before. So, not necessarily dance their entire careers within one company. And that's, there's some value to that, and just bringing in different perspectives and having that experience of, I made a big change and I survived it, so I could probably do another one and survive it.
Yes, you're a fine example, Jaimie. Now you work with both performers and students. Where do you feel your intervention is most crucial?
I mean, I think probably the work with students. I mean, the work with students is really satisfying because particularly, I mean, I'm not a child psychologist, so I generally only work with students between the ages of 16 and 19. But it's quite a crucial stage in terms of their development. And, you know, the hope is that if they develop some good strategies and skills, good psychological skills in those ages, that they can carry those forward with them. So I think in terms of impact, you know, doing it earlier is better if possible. But then there are obviously sort of key professional and age stages where it's really useful to have some kind of independent support. Some of the work that I'm doing more and more of as well is actually working with teachers a bit more within the school systems, because of course they're really important adults in those students' lives and they see them a lot on a daily basis. And, you know, like I said before, most dancers are quite psychologically healthy. You know, it's unusual for me to see sort of clinical psychological need within the dancers that I work with. And so, you know, with a little bit of skilling up, teachers and parents, you know, are probably the best placed people to support, you know, young dancers when they're struggling psychologically. So I sort of see my role more as a little bit of a nudge here and there, but also, you know, just helping the students to really engage with the trusted adults that are around them, who can be very, very helpful. And particularly when it comes to the parents, who are the ones who love them best and are in it for the long haul. So, you know, it's important that they are continuing to really, you know, have a good, strong relationship, particularly in the context of many of those young people living far away from home. So it could be easy for them to sort of get detached from their parents.
Yes, the teacher does become an incredibly important part in a ballet career, and often more or less, you know, taking the place of parents when they're away. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's less of a need for that, the kind of taking the place of parents, particularly because, you know, it's so much easier for young people at ballet schools now to keep in close, you know, daily contact with their parents. They, you know, if they want to. And, you know, I think, I mean, I would just, as a sort of note of caution, I mean, I certainly don't think that to be an effective ballet teacher, you know, you need to be a psychologist, you know, and nor should they be expected, you know, because actually the wonderful thing is that they have a job to do. And for that young person, they go into the studio and they know what, you know, they know what they're there for. Yeah. And it's to focus all of their energy and attention on the task at hand. And so, and it's, you know, and it's wonderfully engrossing, you know, dancing. And so it's great for that. So as much as possible, we sort of don't want to be sort of tinkering with that too much and taking their attention away from the task at hand. But obviously when things go a bit wrong, then it's totally appropriate to have a gentle intervention.
Yes, just a slightly sour note. We find this, I mean, a lot in sports, the parents who stand on the sidelines at a football match and scream at their children to do better. And I mean, looking at some of these huge dance competitions, there are some very, very pushy parents around. And but I suppose in your field, you probably don't come into contact with those. But I'm sure you're aware of some dancers that have that background of parents who were extremely pushy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I feel a huge amount of compassion for parents, you know, particularly ones who, you know, are kind of courageous enough to sort of hand their children over at a, you know, relatively tender age, you know, and allow them to move away from home. And I think, you know, in my experience, even when I disagree with you know, some of the parenting, I generally believe that the parents are trying to do their best for their children. And I think particularly for parents who don't have that much experience, and why would they, of the dance world. You know, there's a lot of pressure on parents to kind of be everything and to be the biggest advocates of their children and to get it all right, and to, you know, there's a sort of expectation that the parents kind of need to be equal players. And so I think sometimes with parents, it's just about understanding actually what is their role and how can they best support their children. And generally, it's actually not getting overly involved in the dancing stuff and just really paying attention to everything else to do with their children, and making sure that their children understand that you know, that their love isn't conditional on how successful they are as dancers.
Yes.
And to be fair, most parents get that absolutely, you know, but
Yes.
sometimes parents get really anxious about, you know, helping their child to be successful in the thing that they care really deeply about, which I have a huge amount of compassion for them.
Yes.
About that.
We've got one more question about taking time off for injuries. How can you help a dancer who gets serious injuries and are off for a long time?
Yeah. Getting injured is really tough for a dancer. And, you know, the way that sometimes that we talk about it is, you know, it sort of strikes at some of the things that are most central, you know. So if we sort of think about, you know, there's a model of kind of, you know, human need and motivation, which looks at 3 key things. And those are a sense of belonging, that we, you know, it's really important for human beings that we feel like we belong to a group. A sense of sort of autonomy or control, and a sense of kind of being competent at what we do. And so you can see that injury kind of strikes at all 3 of those things, doesn't it? Suddenly you don't have control over your body. You are kind of, you know, not with everybody else doing what they're doing, so you feel a bit isolated, and you know, and you don't feel competent at the thing which you're most competent at, which is being a dancer. So it can be really challenging, and so, you know, we often sort of look at, you know, what are ways that they can meet those needs for autonomy and competence and belonging, whilst they're injured and they're going through that. But also helping them to recognize too that, you know, of course, there are always ways that we could, you know, be making improvements in our training to try and prevent injuries, but it's a high risk activity, being a ballet dancer, you know. So you know, there's no perfect training method which completely protects you from injury. So that's kind of part of the deal when you sign up to become a professional dancer, is that you know, you're opening yourself up to a certain amount of physical risk and injury. And I mean, I've never met a dancer who's gone through a career without having at least one injury. Often they have many. And we're getting better at that, you know, we're getting better at managing injuries, preventing injury, but we'll never be able to.
And working in a company, obviously there's good support to get you back on stage, which again, the freelance dancer or the contemporary dancer in a project based has a huge problem with. But that's a whole other issue.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, obviously the Royal Ballet is one of the best resourced companies, certainly in the UK. And they have a wonderful ballet healthcare team that's very focused on, you know, making sure that dancers are fit and healthy and able to be on stage as much as possible.
Okay. Yeah. There's a question from Chenchi Tsao. Hope I pronounced that right. Sometimes dancers might experience different levels of stage fright. How common is the issue amongst dancers? Is it something each dancer just has to deal with personally, or is this something that can be helped by coaching?
Yeah, no, absolutely, it can be helped. I mean, the first thing I think to recognize is that, you know, it would be a bit strange if dancers didn't experience any stage fright. You know, you're kind of, you're doing a really scary thing. You're going out in front of thousands of people and trying to do something very difficult where there's, you know, a pretty good chance that it's not all going to go right. So again, there's that aspect of, I suppose, slightly normalizing, you know, the kind of the nerves and things, and that kind of tells you to some extent that you're doing something that you care about really deeply, the fact that you're feeling a bit anxious about it. But certainly with some dancers, it can kind of turn into a bit of a destructive, worry and anxiety. And sometimes that's about very specific things, or it becomes more sort of generalized, that worry or anxiety, that stage fright. It's also something that we sometimes see through the career, that you can sort of predict that there's some times in the career where the stage fright's going to increase a little bit. Interestingly, it doesn't tend to be at the start of the career. And sort of as people are rising, it doesn't tend to be so much in that phase, because there's just lower expectations on them. And but when someone gets that promotion, particularly to principal, and suddenly it's like, oh, now I have to be a principal every time I go on stage, and that means something. Then people can kind of get a little bit more anxiety. So it's, yeah.
Was that a personal experience for you, Jaimie? It sounds as though it might have been a little bit.
You know what? I mean, in part, I don't think I gave myself long enough to really test that. I mean, I certainly experienced some stage fright. There were certain moments that it was very acute. But, I think I probably did experience that aspect of, whilst I was being pushed, sort of beyond my rank, kind of what was expected of me, that I often didn't have much stage fright in those moments. But yeah, I wouldn't, I don't think I'm a fair example, because, I didn't stick it out long enough. I retired around the age of 30. So, so I kind of, I think it's often those sort of between 30 and 40 plus. Yeah.
Yes, that also combines with the fear of competition and all that sort of thing that's coming up.
Yeah, and again, it's often related to the expectations we have for ourselves, and there's that interesting phase, sort of when you're moving from your late 20s into your 30s and onwards, where you have a really acute sense of what good is, but you have a body that you have to work harder and harder to get the same results often. So that can bring some kind of anxiety. Your body's not responding in the same way that it did. You have to sort of adapt your approach, because if you just keep on expecting your body to respond in the way that it did when you were 22, when you're 35, it's not likely to. So I think one of the people often, when they think of dancers, they often think of flexibility, and they think of physical flexibility. But actually, I think the greatest skill of the dancer is psychological flexibility, because even though it's a short career, you need to adapt your approach many, many times during that short career, because you have this changing body and this sort of, changing experiences as an artist, which mean that you can't give the same performance over and over again.
Yes, that's an amazing insight, Jaimie. We've got a question from Susan. When a student or dancer is faced with a personal crisis, divorce, bereavement, etc., what can you do to support them?
Well, with some specific issues, I would be probably more assessing and then referring on. So, there's some specific sort of, I suppose, crisis issues where if it's quite acute, then you certainly want to be going to a psychologist or another, mental health specialist who's very specialist in that area. But, I think my approach is two things. One is, I think it's useful to have a person who understands the challenges of the industry and of the training, who can kind of hold that and allow that dancer to get back into the studio and do the thing which is meaningful to them whilst they're going through these difficult life experiences. And the other is to sort of look at how those experiences might be influencing their behavior in ways that are not helping them, that are kind of prolonging or worsening the distress that they're experiencing.
And again, it would be very much a personal, the way you treat everybody would be different.
Yeah.
Jaimie, there are no more questions. You've given us a huge amount of really wonderful insight into your work and the company and how the dance world operates. And is there anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, that was really interesting. It's always kind of, you know, it's a useful reflective moment for me as well, to kind of stop, because my head is in it all of the time, isn't it? And to sort of think a little bit sort of critically, and have to communicate what my work is. And it's you know, what I would say is that it's a huge privilege to do the work that I do, and I find it incredibly meaningful to be able to come back into this world with this new professional hat on, because I love the dance world very much, but I also kind of think there are things that we can continue to evolve and improve in it. So it feels very meaningful to have even a small role in contributing to that.
Yes, just a little aside about treating dancers. The wonderful Freddie Franklin, who died some years back and was on stage even till his 90s. When I asked him what was the most important thing he thought about the dance world of today, he said that dancers were being treated like human beings. He said, in my day, we were just thrown on stage. And I thought that was such an interesting, he wasn't sort of going to just talk about himself. He was so interested in the young people because he was still a member of American Ballet Theatre and going on stage with them, and kept his youth and kept his vitality, and could see the important changes that were made in the dance world to help young people.
Yeah, and it's like I say, it's hugely satisfying, because they're, you know, as a group of people to work with, you kind of couldn't ask for better. You know, they know how to do hard work. They're willing to sort of put in the time and the effort. They're hugely conscientious, if I was to generalize, you know, and so it's kind of a psychologist's dream, really, to work with people like that. And you know, and the added benefit of still being able to be involved in the work which I have sort of, you know, a great love of. So yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Maggie.
Susan, do you want to continue with London
hello.
Ballet Circle business?
Hello, and thank you. Oh, Jaimie, that's absolutely fascinating. What a tremendously insightful evening it's been. Something that we don't really know that much about. We are well aware that companies and schools are offering much more mental and medical support for their students and dancers, but this is really fascinating. It's really honed in on this aspect, and that's just been so great. I can only imagine the benefit that the young dancers at schools and in the companies must get from working with you. It's a real privilege for them as much as for you, I'm sure. So thank you so much, Maggie. Your questions, you just got right to all the great stuff we wanted to know. So thank you both so very much. Just, yeah, it's been a really great night.
It's been a great pleasure for me too. Thank you, Jaimie. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you both.
Please join us for our next Zoom in conversation with Joe Powell Main on August 11th. Joe is a freelance dancer and choreographer on wheels and crutches. He's quite an interesting fellow, so I think it's going to be a good night. We also have been invited on the 24th of July to Masters of Ballet Academy Summer Intensive to spend the day with them from 10 a.m. on. So that's Elena. I can never pronounce her name properly. Glurjitz from English National Ballet, who's running that school, and it's a great day. And finally, our next in-person / Zoom conversation will be held at the Royal Ballet School on September 8th, and our guest will be Royal Ballet Principal Melissa Hamilton. So you can book your place for all these on the website, www.tlbc.org.uk. So we look forward to seeing you again. So again, Jaimie and Maggie, thank you so very much. It's been really great. I'm at a loss. And I'm sure that the members, all who have watched, members and their guests, have really gained something tonight. So thank you once again. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. I do hope you'll join us again. And in the meantime, take care. Have a lovely rest of your evening. And I hope we'll see you very soon. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.